Good morning, everyone. I'm Amy Campbell, and I appreciate you letting me to do a recorded message to report on the legislative session this year. I am on my way to Pine Ridge with the Iowa Nurses Association, so I wasn't able to be there in person. I'm not going to lie, this was a rough year, not just because of the complexity of the bills, but the sheer volume of bills that were being introduced. There were 1,791 bills introduced in the 112 days of session, and 1 in 10 of those bills, or 197, made it to the governor's desk. The governor signed all but 5 bills, and she line item vetoed 4 other budget bills. None of the things vetoed were things that the League of Women Voters of Iowa were tracking. Of course, the center point of this legislative session started on day 1 and ended on day 112, the final day of session, when legislators finally agreed to a property tax reform compromise. In the end, they capped local government property taxes at 2%. They replaced the homestead property tax credit with a 10% deduction on assessed valuation. And they created a new multi-residential property tax classification, which some landlords are saying could increase rents by as much as 6% over the next year. In addition, county assessors will have to provide more justification for large increases in valuation, and the League of Cities and the Iowa State Association of Counties will be working together to develop a new property tax form that is much more user-friendly and understandable to Iowa property taxpayers. So I wanted to start off with some good news. I don't get to do that very often. In the end, the governor allocated $25 million for water quality to remove nitrates from the Des Moines Water Works and water system. So while the League of Women Voters would have preferred to see reductions in source of nitrates, this was a significant investment in trying to improve central Iowa's water quality. In addition, the governor found $10 million available for small, rural, or medium-sized communities to be able to improve their wastewater and water infrastructure as well. On the education side, there is a continued move toward improving civic understanding. And so the legislature did pass a bill that would create a new seal of civics excellence. That's hard to say. Seal of civics excellence, which is similar to the seal of biliteracy. High schoolers would be able to achieve this seal on their diplomas if they can demonstrate excellent knowledge of civic participation and community involvement. It's not often that I have good things to talk about on reproductive rights. And this year, the legislature did pass a bill that allowed pregnant minors to consent to their own prenatal, intranatal, and postnatal care. Right now, they can consent to the care for their infants, but not to their own care. Speaking of kids, child care workers will also be able to access and be eligible for child care assistance and under a bill that was signed into law earlier this year. And we will start to invest for the first time ever in pediatric cancer research with $3 million dedicated each year beginning this year. As you can see this year in the report, there was a lot of good news around human trafficking and sexual assault and domestic violence survivor services. Not only was there an increase in funding, just over $300,000 for victim services, there was also investment in the first time ever for a new model of care, trauma-informed care for victims called the SAFE Center, which stands for Sexual Assault Forensic Exam Center. And it is intended to wrap services around victims of human trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual assault. Unfortunately, now I have to talk about bad. It's an election year, so we have to have some voting bills. This year the legislature eliminated the ability of a voter to attest to another. So while voters could attest to somebody who may have forgotten their ID at home in the primaries, they will no longer be able to do that in the November election. In addition, they added a second citizenship oath and a second penalty to the voter registration forms that will need to be signed by individuals who are registering to vote. The Secretary of State will also begin performing SAVE system checks annually under legislation that passed, as well as monthly for any new voters. In addition, after 90 days, if a registration is still pending or unconfirmed or incomplete, that will be canceled. On the education side, this is not necessarily bad. 8th grade and 11th graders will have social studies assessments completed, but the bad side is they did remove the requirement that curriculum be multicultural, gender fair, and include global perspectives. Finally, this is also not necessarily bad, but the three Regents universities will now have to include 2 new 3-hour courses in their core curriculum for all undergraduates, one in American history and one in American government. Critics say this could add to the cost of and time to complete an undergraduate degree. There were a lot of changes in education, as you'll see in the report. For those of you that are former educators or current educators, there was a whole reform of the charter school system. But really the biggest bill this year that caused the most controversy was the new classroom clear bill, which adds a new process for classroom clears for nonviolent disruptions. And in that bill, it also includes a pilot program in a rural and urban school district that would allow a school to have a separate school, so a separate attendance center for students who are getting special education or are disruptive. So this has to be voluntary in order for it to be legal, but the legislature wants to try out having special education students being separate. So that is, of course, of concern to parents of students with disabilities or students who are receiving special education, that they will somehow still continue to be separate or othered. Finally, on the reproductive rights side, there is some bad. While pregnant minors can consent to their own care, they won't be able to consent to getting an HPV vaccine or a vaccine for preventing sexually transmitted diseases. We will now require in the state parental permission in order to get an HPV or STD vaccine. 2 other bills I want to talk about. One is an abortion bill, which could have been much, much worse. It started off being a black market medication abortion bill, which is what it never was. It was a completely unworkable bill that would have pretty much ended access to medication abortions in the state of Iowa. As it ended up, the bill adds some new informed consent requirements, which basically require a patient to sign a form just stating that they understand the risks that are on the label and what to do if they encounter any kind of side effects, things that doctors say they already do. One thing that is a silver lining in this bill is that physicians ask that in the definition of abortion in Iowa code, they remove miscarriage and ectopic pregnancy, which was causing a lot of concern and confusion in emergency situations. So that is something that is actually a silver lining to this bill. However, the bill does appear to end telemedicine medication abortions by any Iowa licensed physician in the state. So that would require an in-person visit, which may be problematic for individuals living in rural areas. There is some confusion about whether it would apply to out-of-state licensed physicians providing medication abortions via telemedicine. It appears that it might also continue to be allowed, but that also depends on what happens federally. Finally, I want to talk about the Medical Defensive Ethics Act. This bill states that a health professional does not have to provide a service if it conflicts with their moral, religious, or ethical beliefs. In addition, professional licensing boards cannot discipline them for them. Employers cannot fire them for them. You may not even be able to ask them questions related to the provision of services in a job interview. It is a highly litigious bill and is likely to be ending up in courts. While this is touted as protecting providers from providing abortion care or gender affirming care, it is not defined and it is broad and wide open. Finally, I want to talk about the 3 strikes bill. This bill passed in the final days of session and was signed into law this week. It requires third-time felony offenders to be sentenced as a habitual offender, and instead of serving an additional 3 years, it would be 7 years, and it does not allow earned time to reduce that minimum. So that is concerning on its face. However, what is absolutely concerning is that the fiscal impact of this is nearly $2 billion in needed additional infrastructure build. $2 billion infrastructure cost in order to provide the infrastructure needed to house these additional prisoners and offenders. In addition, on top of that, the cost for operating the additional space is $116 million annually, and you know that will grow. These are dollars that were not appropriated and are not available, and I want to end on talking about the budget. In your document, you will find a page that is entitled Budget Warning Bells, and that's exactly what I want to talk about. Our budget is in the state of Iowa, we are required to spend 99% of the revenues we take in. However, over the past several years, since we cut income taxes, we have been saving up funding in a taxpayer relief fund to help us get through the shortfall. And the concept is that as income taxes are cut, then the economy grows and our budget will catch up and we will no longer have to rely on those short-term funds. But as you will see in this document, we are not recovering fast enough to compete and to cover the shortfall in our budgets. This year, we had a one-time HMO tax that it can only happen one time to fill Medicaid, and that won't be there next year. We have a $2 billion budget expense hanging over our head for this prison infrastructure in additional operations, in addition to the additional costs that we just have every year growing for healthcare and education. So we are in a shortfall. We are $1.3 billion under revenues right now. And that leads me to my final comment. SJR 11 passed this year for the second time and will appear on the ballot as a constitutional measure to require 2/3 majority vote for any kind of income-based tax. That's a millionaire tax. That's a tax on endowments. Anything that is income-based would require 2/3 majority vote. This is giving us very little options in revenue generation to help fill the budget gap. And as you will see on that pie chart, 78% of the budget is made up of HHS and education. You add prisons to that and you're close to 90%. So we are facing a challenge, and there's not going to be any good choices in cutting revenues if we cannot find a way to increase it. And we've cut the ability of local governments to fill in any kind of gaps as well. So as you look at this, you know that probably our only option is going to be a sales tax. But of course, the first increment of the sales tax is already constitutionally protected for water quality, environment, and outdoor recreation programs. So the choices are not going to be good for the new governor and the new legislature. We probably have 1 or 2 more years to be able to use this cushion, but if our economy does not grow, does not turn around, our options are going to be pretty dismal. So I hate to end on a bad note like that, but I think we have no shortage to talk about with our legislators and our elected officials and the people running for office this year, and a lot of challenges facing our state right now. So I hope that you all find some hope in all of this. And I am happy to talk about anything that I've left off. Feel free to email me at amy@ialobby.com. And when I get back from Pine Ridge, I will answer your questions. So thank you very much and have a great day.